Something for Nothing by Stephen Baxter as S.M. Baxter. Originally published in the spring 1988 issue of Interzone magazine, republished in a collection of the author's stories entitled Traces in 1998. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel Quasar Spectra. Something for Nothing. We drifted beside the alien ship. Bluish stars streamed towards us at half the speed of light. "Fantastic," Harris rumbled. "Nothing I like more than something for nothing." His massive frame floated upside down before a computer terminal. George and I had our noses jammed up against a viewport. "Yes, fantastic," breathed George. I turned and stared at his gaunt profile. "A windfall for the whole human race," he said. "I don't believe it," I said. "You two haven't agreed on any damn thing since the three of us climbed into this box 6 months ago." But Harris was glaring at George's skinny neck. "What's the human race got to do with my overtime payments?" And that was it. George fluttered away from the port. Harris loomed over him. "Wasting processing time on trivialities, time and a half or double time." And so it went. Of course, Harris had a point. It was just the viciousness of his argument. We were the fastest humans in history. Thanks to Einstein, time passed 13% slower for us than for the folks back home. "We're like Apollo 11, mused George. "Entering unexplored velocity realms. There's no precedent in law for overtime payments under relativistic time dilation conditions," boomed Harris. "I'm keeping a speed log on the computer, and if you're thinking of deleting it—" He waved a huge fist. "Always looking for something for nothing, aren't you?" George sneered. And so on. Sometimes I wondered if we'd all survived the trip. A warning buzzed. The argument paused, and we grabbed handholds. Our ship was a monstrous magnetic bell topped by a life pod. A small fusion bomb went off inside the bell, and the floor slammed against our feet. When I turned back to the port, we'd jerked a little closer to our rendezvous. Our ship worked. We'd managed to catch up with the mysterious alien as it arced past the solar system. But it was like riding a plummeting lift, and it had had us at each other's throats since the first month. I rubbed my bruised feet. George and Harris got back to their argument. "What a life," I thought gloomily, and got a coffee. We prepared for rendezvous, still bickering. Sol was a red-shifted blur an eighth of a light year away. The alien ship was no bigger than our life pod. It looked smoothed by age, like an old brain. We secured a line. George flapped gingerly around what looked like a port in the melted-looking hull. Harris headed for what had to be a drive tube. And me? Remember Mike Collins, the sap who'd stayed in orbit while Neil and Buzz got the glory on the moon? I'm a historian and linguist. I wouldn't get to leave the ship unless real-life aliens opened the hatch and shook George by the hand. Or maybe the throat. When they didn't, I took time out to clean the coffee percolator. It's amazing how the grounds collect. I heard George panting as he worked. Then he gasped. I saw him tumble awkwardly into space as a panel lifted out and aside from the alien hull. "Ha!" George exulted. "Did you get that?" "Yeah," I said. "Congratulations. There was a magnetic lock embedded in the hull, a prime number code designed to be opened by intelligence, not by accident." From around the curve of the vessel, Harris muttered, "But you managed it. So where did they mess up?" "Do you want to repeat that?" George snapped. "What do you see in there?" I said hastily. George poked a torch inside the hatchway. No life. A single cabin about the size of ours. Airless, empty except for 3 items. An array of what looked like crystal cubes. A data bank? A sort of flask set on a pillar. And something like an old-fashioned cathode ray tube set into a control panel. It's all got the smoothed-over look of the ship's exterior. Stand by. His feet followed him into the hatch. Take it easy, George. I can confirm this is a drive tube. Harris growled. His instruments were arrayed around a circular mesh set in the hill. It's an ion drive. Nothing fancy. This is a high-voltage grid, and it's operating now. The acceleration's about 0.5 of a G. I tried a joke. So don't get shaken loose. I got ignored. Harris collected up his instruments in silence. Harris was our professional astronaut. He had flight experience going back to the last days of the old space shuttle, and the point of a flight for him was the money, the fame, and what they would buy him. Do you want to think about that acceleration for a while? He asked coldly. It looks like there's a couple of altitude jets around the hill, he said. He swept confidently over the alien's starlit curves. I finished with the percolator and turned reluctantly to the computer. After a couple more hours, they finished their EVA and drifted stiffly back into the cabin. Until you try it, it's hard to appreciate how tough it is to work in weightless conditions. Even Harris, the Paragon, looked shaky, and as for George, well, he was just a physicist. His face was a mask over his coffee nipple. Neither of them remarked how good the coffee tasted since I'd cleaned the perk, but I didn't let it bother me. I've worked out the consequences of the alien's acceleration, I said to Harris. He's blasting sideways, deflecting. He's turning in a circle 500,000 light-years wide. Harris grunted and closed his eyes, still breathing hard. Obviously, my toil at the terminal had confirmed what he'd known instinctively all along. I was so glad. George eyed me, still ashen. That means nothing. It's too big. Think of it in real terms. How big's the galaxy? Maybe 100,000 light-years across. So you're turning circles 5 times the size of the galaxy. He got, if anything, paler. It's maneuvering round the galactic core. Harris's eyes snapped open. You're crazy. George shook his head weakly. No, we assumed the alien came from a nearby star. From within our galaxy, at least. It was a reasonable guess. But we were wrong. It's cutting through our galaxy on its way somewhere else. He swallowed. And it's in the middle of a course correction to avoid the core. It all fits in. A course correction on that scale, Harris said acidly, would take maybe 1,000,000 years. I know, George said miserably. How could anyone think on that scale? It's appalling. Harris looked as if he wanted to spit. But you don't spit in 0G. Instead, he dumped his coffee and went to a terminal. He called up a 3-dimensional extrapolation of the alien's path. The orange line snaked backwards from our present position and south out of our galaxy. What did you mean it fits in? I asked George. Fits in with what? What did you find out over there? He cuddled his coffee cup like a teddy bear. You know the flask I mentioned on top of a small pillar? Yeah. Guess what I found inside? Don't be stupid, George, Harris muttered absently. It was a quarter full of potassium-40, and filled up with the radioactive products of potassium-40. See? Oh, God. You've lost me, George, I said. I think it's a clock. At the start of the voyage, I think it was full of potassium-40. The amount it's decayed tells us how long the ship's been traveling. It must have traveled for about 2 half-lives of the potassium. My scalp crawled, which adds up to about 2.6 billion years. I shook my head. I can't get that into perspective, George. Don't try, he said dolefully. That little ship's been traveling for half the lifetime of the Earth. I hate it. How could they think so big? Ha! Harris snapped. Here's the proof that this is just another line of crap. He'd expanded the scale on his display. The aliens' projected paths stirred galaxies like bees. Now it lanced through what looked like a bubble in a Swiss cheese. This is the nearby universe, Harris said. Nearby on a scale of billions of light years, anyway. The galaxies aren't spread out uniformly. There's this bubble-like structure, hollows surrounded by clusters and filaments of galaxies. It's fantastic, I breathed. How come? George made to answer, but Harris cut in dismissively. Cosmology. The Big Bang, the Big Crunch, all of that, who cares? The point is that if Baldy over there is right, the alien's 2-billion-year flight must have taken him right through at least one bubble. This one here, see? He hauled himself over to George. He had a way of using his physical presence as a weapon. You'll concede I know something about ion drives. They've been my living for 20 years. He forced a nod out of George. Ion drives are efficient, but they still need reaction mass. You've always got to spit something out the back to move forward. He waved towards the viewport. To cross a void like that, the alien would have needed a fuel tank 1,000 miles wide. I can't say I noticed it. Did you? Damn it. After 1 billion years, half the whole metal should have evaporated. George squeezed his eyes shut and said nothing. His lips were white. After a little more pointless cruelty, Harris climbed into his sleeping sack, smirking with his triumph. George looked as if he was asleep where he drifted. I thought of how these arguments blew up out of nowhere. Something created from nothing. I cleared up the coffee cups. Our next interpersonal crisis came a couple of days later. I watched from my safe distance as George hunched over the artifact that looked like a cathode ray tube. He tweaked its controls gingerly. He made notes on little labels which he stuck to the control panel. Soon the alien console was covered with bits of his spidery writing. Harris drifted in, a microblaster in his hand. George flapped at him, excited. Harris, I've been doing some experiments. So have I. Harris grinned slyly. Watch. He raised the blaster and carved a piece out of the nearest wall. George gurgled and launched himself across the cabin, a jumble of limbs. You've no right! You've no right! He clung to Harris's arm. Harris ignored his feathery mass. Take a look, he said calmly. The wall was repairing itself. Fibers extended across the scar and twisted together. The resulting patch softened down and fused. It was like watching bones knit. George let go. Harris said, Think what a piece of this would be worth back on Earth. If we can get hold of some of the commercial rights. George bristled. Harris, you can't just hack bits off this ship. Harris patted a suit pocket. I already have. He laughed in George's face. I said quickly, This explains a lot. Why the ship looks smoothed over. It must have been patched thousands of times. This is how it's survived 2 billion years. Harris sneered. You'd still need raw material. George remembered his discovery. He recovered his excitement. Yes, that's what I've found out. Harris ignored him and adjusted his blaster. Back off, Harris, I said. Let him show what he's got." Harris shrugged theatrically. He mimicked George's reedy voice. "Yes, George, let's see what you found." And he made himself comfortable, braced against an interior strut of the alien ship, right in the middle of the place George had been working. George waited for him to move. Harris just folded his arms. George had to climb past him. I saw his expression. He made sure the monitor camera could see him. He pointed to the ray tube. "This is a sort of micro-teleportation device," he said. Harris yawned. "Mass enters the device here, via this feed, as a beam of neutrons. Mass comes out by this feed here, as a beam of what are called W particles. The mass that comes out is about 90 times what goes in." While we thought about that, he went on. "The extra mass is passed out for further processing. Reaction mass for the ion drive, repair material for the hull, and so on." Harris got ready to say something very unpleasant. I got in first. "Run that again, George. You're saying 90 times as much mass comes out as goes in, right?" he said calmly. "At the risk of sounding stupid, doesn't that violate the conservation of mass? Shouldn't that be impossible?" George tried to scratch his cheek. His hand bumped into his faceplate. The astronaut watched him clinically. "It's a little involved," George said. "In about 15 minutes, a free neutron in that tube will decay. It breaks up into a proton, an electron, and an antineutrino. And mass is conserved. Sure, but before those products are formed, the neutron emits a W particle, which instantly breaks up into the electron and the antineutrino. So..." It's hard to believe Harris could get so much spite into one syllable. "The W has about 90 times the electron's mass. No mass conservation, right? A paradox. But it makes no difference. Usually the lifetime of the W is so brief that..." He struggled to stick to English. "It's within the uncertainty limits of quantum mechanics." I hate that word, quantum. "You're saying that the W disappears so quickly that it doesn't really matter." He struggled with that. "Well, no, not really," he said unhappily, "but I can't think of a better way of putting it. The point is, the aliens have found some way of catching the Ws before they evaporate. So they create mass," I said. "So George is a cracked teapot," said Harris. "Come on, that bull boils down to something for nothing." The practical man sneered at the scientist. "It's impossible." I couldn't resist it. "I thought you were quite keen on something for nothing. I mean, your overtime..." George chortled. Harris's face darkened. "Mass can't appear from nowhere," he said stubbornly. George actually patted his head. I winced. We'd pay for this later. "Very good," George said cockily. "I believe that the mass that's extracted here must be disappearing from somewhere else in the universe, in other quantum events. As I said, it's a sort of micro-teleportation, a few grams a day, no need for huge fuel tanks. In fact..." He had to reach around Harris to get to his sticky labels. "I think these are controls for moving the sink, the point in space from which the matter would come. You'd put it in a matter-rich place, say the heart of a star." His face clouded. "But I'm making slow progress with the controls. There are a lot of safeguards. You wouldn't want the sink within the structure of the ship, for example." "Well, you keep at it, George," Harris said icily. "And make sure you put your pretty labels on places where I can hack this gizmo out and take it home." George smoldered. "Look, Harris..." Isn't it time for your break, Harris? I put in quickly. He checked his watch. Yeah, thanks. And he closed his eyes and snuggled down to sleep, right where he was. George clambered round his massive body, jerking with frustration. I sighed. Do you suppose Mike Collins had all this trouble with Neil and Buzz? I stared at a video screen full of numbers. I was trying to make sense of the electromagnetic patterns George had recorded within the last of the 3 alien artifacts, the crystal arrays. To be perfectly honest, it wasn't much consolation for finding the ship lifeless. I don't think it's my field, anyway, I said to George. We floated in our sleeping sacks, sipping coffee. It was the end of one of their EVA cycles. The cabin was peaceful in the absence of Harris, who was still packing up. I don't think it's text. As much as anything, it reminds me of a map of the structure of DNA. Well, that fits in, he said gloomily. Knowledge seemed only to oppress him. With what? An idea I've been forming about the ship's purpose. Have you thought about that? He let go his coffee cup and struggled out of the sack. In his underpants, he looked like a bag of bones. He began to work at one of the computer terminals. I gathered my thoughts. Not much, I admitted. These people weren't much beyond us in technology. The micro-teleport device and the healing walls are within our understanding, at least, and they didn't have faster-than-light travel, for instance. And yet they thought big, George said. 1 billion years big. Harris says it would have taken the probe 1,000 years just to get up to speed. But why? Where is it headed? He'd called up a projection of the alien's path. The orange line arced through the smoke-like bubbles and filaments of the large-scale universe. Where were they sending a record of their equivalent of DNA? A record of what was most uniquely themselves? That's just my guess about the DNA, George, I warned. Look at this, he said. Right at the edge of the visible universe was a dull blue blob. The orange line pierced it. A quasar, breathed George. A relic of the universe's birth. I shrugged inside my sack. So, it's a quasar probe. His eyes were large and unhappy. But not just any quasar. There's a theory that one day we'll identify a quasar at the site of the original Big Bang, and maybe of the Big Crunch, if it comes, the death of everything, the final collapse of the universe. I goggled. Could that quasar be it? George shrugged. Maybe they knew something we don't. They're 1 billion years dead, he said forcefully. But they had ambition. I believe they did their best to send a piece of themselves to the end of everything. Who knows? Maybe they thought something could survive in some way. I nodded slowly. He wrapped his hands together. I believe we've no right to interfere with this ship. We should respect the builder's memory. We can't let Harris hack off bits and take them home. His eyes widened. Where is Harris? And he hustled to the suit cupboard. Here we go again, I thought. I struggled out of my sack. Harris was using his microblaster. He was slicing out the micro-teleportation device, severing cables and supports in a rough sphere. The alien ship was trying to repair itself, but Harris could move faster. He hummed as he worked. George crashed in. You bastard! Watching from the life pod, I shouted into their ears. Take it easy. Hold off for a while, Harris. There's no rush. Let's talk it through. Eventually he shrugged. Okay. He turned off the blaster and settled into his usual place, slap in the middle of George's work area. Let's talk. He played with the blaster just to keep the temperature up. George hung in the center of the cabin for a long while, breathing deeply. Then, remarkably controlled, it seemed to me, he wormed his way round Harris to the control console of the teleport device. He faced Harris, his hands behind his back on the console. "I can't agree that you should do this," he began. Harris's tone was sweet. "Who's going to stop me? You? This ship's not ours to take apart. It's immoral." George's voice was deadly even. I noticed his arms moving slightly, but I couldn't see what his hands were doing. Harris's eyes pinned George like a cat's. He was enjoying this. Immoral. Listen, the people who built this thing are long dead. Even their descendants must be gone. Their son folded up or novaed. What do they care? Would you smash up a gravestone to build a wall? Harris grinned. Maybe. This isn't immorality, it's immortality. For all of us, when this thing's on display in the Smithsonian. And so it went on, round and round, in diminishing circles, for hours. We'd had months of practice at this sort of scene. As time wore on, however, I noticed George doing a higher proportion of the talking. He argued patiently, reasonably, and totally uncharacteristically. Harris started to look uncomfortable. He was sweating, and occasionally scratched his chest and armpit. But of course there was no question of him moving from his chosen position, until he gave a surprised gurgle, clutched at his chest, and folded up. George grabbed him. Blood came from Harris's mouth in great globes that stuck to the inside of his faceplate. We wrapped Harris's body in an improvised flag and pushed it into space. I said some words. Well, he'd been a hero once. We began the painful process of deceleration. The first grinding fusion explosions were the worst. It would take over a year of this to get us home. George and I drifted side by side. The cabin was embarrassingly large. We watched as the alien ship and Harris disappeared into the structure of the large-scale universe. "Well, he got what he wanted," George said. "Immortality. He's heading for the big crunch with the alien ship. He might be all that's left of humanity when the end comes. He'll be the most famous man in the universe. What more could he ask?" He giggled. "Do you think we should send his overtime payments after him?" "It can't have been easy overriding the safeguards," I said dryly. His head swiveled towards me. "What safeguards?" "On the controls of the mass sink, the other end of the micro-teleport. You weren't supposed to be able to bring it inside the ship." He quickly checked that the cabin monitors were off. "Do you want to think about what you're saying?" "I mean, it's possible I overrode some safeguards in my tinkering, but of course," I went on doggedly, "the hard part was keeping Harris in one place long enough for the mass loss to become significant. You handled that final scene very well. I didn't think you had so much understanding of people." "What is this? What mass loss? Harris's heart failure was unfortunate, but the stress of the voyage—" "The teleport device could provide just a few grams a day, you said. Just a few grams would be enough for the alien ship if they came from a star's heart. Just a few grams were enough for you, from Harris's heart." He grinned like a skull. "Prove it." The warning sounded, and the floor began to slam again. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.